Thanks for joining us today for our Reef Resilience Network and Coral Restoration Consortium webinar titled Applying Structured Decision-Making to Inform Reef Management Decisions. My name is Caitlin Lustig, and I'm the South Florida Marine Conservation Manager for the Nature Conservancy and your host for this webinar. Today, we will be hearing from Mayuran, Sivapalan, and Jerome Bowen, who lead the Australian Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program Modeling and Decision Support Subprogram. They'll spend some time talking generally about the structured decision-making process and then lead us through two real-world examples about how it has been used in Australia. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be 1 hour long. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. There are two ways you can ask questions. You can use the question box anytime throughout the webinar to send questions, and we'll keep track of these for the end of the presentation. Or you can raise your hand during the question and answer session of the webinar, and I'll call on you to ask your question during that time. You can raise your hand by clicking on the small hand icon on the toolbar on the left of your name. If you're having technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides, please send us a message via the questions box and we'll try to resolve the issue. Next slide. So first, we'd like to learn a little bit about who's on the call today. So we have two poll questions, and the first one is, what is the focus region of your work? And we'll give you a couple seconds to answer that. Great, so about half the people are from the Caribbean and Atlantic, followed by the Pacific Ocean, Northern Hemisphere, and then some from the Southern Hemisphere and other. Thank you, and our next poll question is, oh, next slide, please. Tell us about the work you do. Are you a marine resource manager, a scientist or researcher, a student, or other? Great, so it looks like majority resource managers or practitioners, a good number of scientists and researchers, and some students and other. Thanks for sharing that with us. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerome and Mayuran.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for joining you at the various time zones that you're at. We're presenting to you today about applying structured decision-making to inform reef management decisions. With this 3 sections to our talk, Mayuran and I will spend about half an hour talking through the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program and how it's being used currently to guide research and development and deployment decisions for coral reef restoration and adaptation. Then we go into briefly an introduction to what structured decision-making is and how we're using it. And in the third section, we'll briefly touch on 2 case studies in reef management where structured decision-making has been used. So though many of you have probably heard of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, I'll just do a very quick introduction to it. So it's a partnership between the Australian government and various scientific and research organisations in Australia. And essentially it's a partnership to deliver the world's largest and most ambitious effort to develop, scale up and deploy interventions and technologies to help the Great Barrier Reef resist and adapt regarding the impacts of climate change. And both Mayuran and I, with backgrounds in environmental engineering, and Mayuran in sort of commerce and finance, and myself in anthropology and politics, this is a very exciting project to work on, as we sort of see it as possibly one of the largest attempts by humanity to help with natural resources management and protect it in the face of climate change. So we're very excited to be working on this project. The modelling and decision support sub-program is a section of the Reef Restoration Adaptation program that Mayuran and I are lucky enough to lead. So essentially, the objective of it is to enable the appropriate people and programs in making, communicating quality decisions. So it's a very complex sub-program. You can see many of the senior leaders of the sub-program here. It's coordinated across 5 institutions. There's 6 major projects within it, about 40 individuals, scientists, engineers, and including software engineers involved in this, and about 30 deliverables each quarter. The funding is about 18 million Australian dollars over 4 years, and essentially we're looking at integrating decision and modelling, and this involves a whole range of human processes, but also modelling, including environmental, ecological, and socio-economic modelling. And given climate change has quite a lot of uncertainties and risks associated with it, there is quite a significant effort in looking to characterise uncertainties and risk. So where does structured decision making fit into such a complex program? So here we have, we won't go into the details so much here, but here's a representation of the complexity of the Reef Restoration Adaptation program. So on the bottom left, we have technological readiness. So you probably recognise many of these technologies and solutions that are being tested within the Reef Restoration Adaptation program, such as cloud brightening, moving corals. But there's also a whole lot of underlying science that needs to be done. A lot of good work being done here about how these work, including ocean and ecosystem modelling, which is part of our sub-program. Then we get to implementation readiness. So how do we get these technologies ready to be implemented? So this includes regulatory and socio-cultural elements, as well as how do we deploy and potentially automate these technologies. Of course, there's lots of governance and program management, and this function is currently also covering elements of getting these technologies ready for commercialization. Who might deploy them? How might we produce them at scale, etc. And this is where the modelling and decision support sub-program really fits in here, taking care of characterising opportunities and risks, and then including cost estimation and benefits estimation into investment cases, allowing some investment prioritisation to be fed into this system. So structured decision making doesn't necessarily provide insights into the science or the technologies. So Mayuran and I, neither of us are experts in coral reef science, but what it does do is bring a lot of this information, the complex flows of it, into a format that allows decision makers to decide potentially where to deploy and potentially where to spend their money to do so. In terms of using structured decision making in coral reef contexts, since 2018, there's been quite a few applications of this, particularly to the Great Barrier Reef. You can see in terms of the investment sizes that these decisions have been used on, they range from the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of decisions. And there's a range of methods, some of which you might be familiar with. So multi-criteria analysis, cost-benefit analysis. But the 2 case studies we're going to talk to today are the 2 ones at the top. One around innovative methods for crown-of-thorns control and surveillance, which I'll hand to Mayuran to talk through now. But before he does, he's going to give a very brief introduction to structured decision making. Over to you, Mayuran.
Thanks, Jerome. So as Jerome mentioned, we've really sort of taken hold of structured decision making as a framework, as a process, a concept applied it not just within the RRAP context over many years, but in other sort of select opportunities and challenges which require insight to be sort of garnered from very complex sort of context and environment of information and knowledge. And so what structured decision making is, it's effectively a framework that's built on 50 years of decision science, much of which emanated out of the US, out of places like Stanford, Colorado School of Mines, MIT. And this science, with very strong natural resource and mathematical bases, basically helps people tackle complex challenges and enable what we call quality decision making. So what are the elements of structured decision making? There's what decision science tells us is there's 6 attributes that constitute and enables a quality decision, starting with a relevant frame. So solving the right problem, ensuring that the right opportunity problem is being tackled. Coming up with creative, doable, credible alternatives. So different ways in which that problem or opportunity can be solved or realized. Having relevant and reliable information. So having a knowledge base that enables us to understand those choices in the context of solving that problem. Having an ability to understand consequences and trade-offs. So that information that we have pertaining to those alternatives allow us to understand what we gain and what we potentially might lose if we were to pursue any one of those choices. Having some form of logical analysis, so some mechanism by which we take that information and we're able to understand those consequences and trade-offs in terms of the relative performance of those choices. And then importantly, achieving a commitment to action. So having a decision maker or decision makers being able to actually commit resources to a preferred or recommended choice. And what we often talk about is that in decision science and structured decision making, this commitment to action piece is really critical. You could have the best and most well-constructed frame, the most comprehensive analysis with the best information, but if you're unable to get that commitment to action, then effectively your potentially decision process has failed. And this commitment to action piece really comes down to people and how you bring people along for the journey in characterizing the problem all the way through to solving the problem in order to achieve that commitment to action. Next slide, please. Now, there are many, many decision contexts, many decisions that organizations, natural resource managers, individuals make, at various timescales, daily timescales, monthly, annual, multi-year. And there's different approaches, obviously, for those decisions. But where structured decision making is especially useful is for strategic challenges where there is a lot of complexity and there is a lot of uncertainty. For example, managing reefs under climate change. And what makes these decisions unique, or these challenges unique, is that they typically subject to multiple competing and conflicting objectives or values. So there's different perspectives on what we're trying to achieve or what the desired outcome might look like. But there's also a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the relative performance of those choices might look like, or how those choices might perform under different conditions. And so where we use structured decision making is where we see these two elements are being at the fore. And the case study we'll talk about shortly, and the ones that Jerome presented earlier, are all these sort of decision challenges where those two conditions are indeed met. Next slide, please. Now, structured decision making is very much a framework, and there's multiple different sort of processes that adhere to structured decision making principles. But typically, if you look through, most of what exists in terms of existing processes and methodologies, they all align to a set of 4 key stages. There's the framing stage, which I mentioned earlier as one of the key attributes, where we're defining the problem or the opportunity, and we're coming up with a long list of how we might solve that problem, and what are all the different objectives and value drivers that are relevant with respect to the performance of those options. There's some form of knowledge generation, a collection and synthesis stage, and that's both in terms of characterizing the choices we have and in understanding those relative values, trade-offs, and consequences. There's then some process for that decision modeling, where we're taking that information and knowledge and we're understanding and communicating, importantly, the relative performance of those choices. And then a stage where we come together and we align on what we found, what we've understood, and achieve that commitment to action and ultimately the decision. And again, core through all of that process is ensuring the relevant people are involved, both in framing the problem, supplying the knowledge, interrogating the insights, and in making the decision. Next slide, please. So the first case study we'll talk through today is pertaining to crown-of-thorns starfish. As many of you know, it's a major pest issue here in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef. And there's a lot of money currently spent in managing crown-of-thorns across the reef. And this project, this opportunity was, well, how could we potentially create a step change and accelerate innovative approaches, both in terms of developing them and having people use them, that improve the efficacy and efficiency of COTS control and surveillance. So this is how can we be more effective with how we manage COTS through a dedicated innovation program. Next slide. Now, I guess assessing and understanding that opportunity and in realizing it, there's all sorts of different challenges that we must explore. What is possible in terms of innovation? What do our stakeholders value? How urgently do we need to see this step change occur? And what are the cost, benefits, and risks of different opportunities that we might have? Next slide. So the way this program approached it was to bring together a very esteemed group of scientists and knowledge brokers, and divided them up into different areas. These 6 areas. So one looking at proximal causes, one looking at the underlying biology and ecology of the ecosystem, and COTS in particular, population control, and then social science and traditional owners. So what's the relevance and the opportunity and the need from a social science standpoint in terms of these opportunities. And these people came together. There's about 50 people or so. Came up with an assessment of the current state of how we manage COTS, and then what are all the different opportunities that we might be worth pursuing in terms of improvement. And 51 different opportunities were identified, equating to about $24 million if we were to pursue all of them, and leaving us with a challenge because the budget here was only $8 million. And so that's where the opportunity for applying structured decision making came about. And before you go to the next slide, Jerome, I'll just acknowledge that the approach I'll be talking about shortly in how we approach this. I do want to acknowledge Dr. Mary Bonnen from the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and Dr. Cam Fletcher from CSIRO, who were thought partners in how we developed and applied this structured decision-making approach. Next slide, please. So the approach we took was to look across all the different opportunities within those 6 buckets and develop portfolios of opportunities. So different ways in which we would come up with an $8 million program that cut across different opportunities within these 6 areas and focusing on a particular outcome. And then selecting those opportunities that consistently appeared in the top performing portfolios. So next slide, please. So, what were these portfolios? So we had, one which was choosing opportunities that really emphasized those which would help us manage the current COTS outbreak. We had another which focused on future outbreaks post 2030. We had another one which was focused exclusively on new control approaches. So through these portfolios, we were able to, I guess, understand what are very distinct approaches we could use to develop a program, and how would these approaches represented by these portfolios perform when compared against one another. Next slide, please. One of the really critical parts of our approach for structured decision making is to elicit a lot of input from subject matter experts and people who are involved in the knowledge base. And the way we do that is through issuing surveys. So what we did is to issue a survey to each of the research leads and the governance group to understand their individual perspectives on how these objectives of the program compared and how did each of the portfolios align to them. Next slide, please. So some of the criteria that we came up with aligning to the objectives of the program, 3 in terms of impact on coral, so the extent of impact, the directness of impact, and the immediacy of impact. We had a 4th one, given this is an innovation program, around the potential for step change and how we manage costs. And then the 2 others, one looking at the extent of co-benefits to traditional owners in the community, and then one speaking to risk. So what's the level of uncertainty we had in that portfolio, delivering an impact on coral. Next slide. And one of the interesting bits of output that come out of this process is we have each of the individual respondents provides us their perspective on how important these objectives are, these criteria are, and allows us to I guess understand where there's strong convergence amongst different groups within the program and different individuals on importance of certain criteria, but also where there's divergence in perspective. And what we typically do is use this output to have a conversation again, emphasizing the people-driven aspects of this approach, getting people to debate and to confer and to understand each other's perspective is a really important part of getting that commitment to action at the end of these processes. Next slide. So you can see here, the first 3 criteria, much more alignment across the different groups in the program, and the last 3, a little bit less alignment. Next slide. We then issued a separate survey to each of the members in the program to have them assess each of the portfolios against those criteria, and that gave us a ranking of which portfolios were seen to be higher performing or better performing than others. So we had here the preventing future outbreaks, number 3 was the top performing, followed by suppressing 2025, and they're both quite similar. Next slide, please. And because we had individual responses from our respondent group, we were able to do a probabilistic analysis where we'd ran 10,000 cases of different combinations of those weights and scores for individuals. And what that told us was that in almost 50% of all responses, the suppress 2025 and the prevent future outbreaks were seen as the superior programs, superior portfolios. Next slide. And so when we then looked into those portfolios, we saw that there were 8 opportunities that were common to both of those portfolios, which were equated to about 60% of the budget. And so what the management of this program were able to do was to get alignment that those 8 should definitely be as part of this program, this innovation program, and then we're able to work with the remaining 40% to be quite tactical in selecting opportunities across different parts of the program that were highly regarded to come up with the final program design. With that, I'll hand over back to Jerome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mayuran. So in the second case study, establishing monitoring priorities for investment. So a very sort of similar decision-making problem to the one that Mayuran presented. There was a funding agency that had significant funds to invest, but the combined project costs of the proposals to the funding agency or the likely proposed projects exceeded the available funding. So I think the interesting part of this process was that the funding agency themselves wanted to have quite a transparent and inclusive process that was needed to prioritise these projects. And so the project proponents all got together and semi-independently from the funding agency decided to go through this process to prioritise the projects amongst themselves to discover which ones best achieved reef outcomes. And so they set an objective, an overall objective or an opportunity to effectively fill the gaps in monitoring and modelling activities, including their integration and application to decision making in order to receive the overarching goals of the Great Barrier Reef management, which is the Reef 2050 plan. And they also added overtime in the most efficient way, which sort of spoke to quite a common tension in program funding decision making about, do you invest for the near term or the long term? And how do you do that in the most efficient way? And we saw that in case study 1 as well. So what was the approach that we took? So firstly, we looked to identify monitoring gaps. So this was quite a detailed work into linking the projects themselves, which you can see on the right, all the way back to the overall objectives for Great Barrier Reef management through the various sort of scientific indicators, metrics, and data. There needed to be a quite detailed discussion amongst the project proponents about the boundaries. So what are we actually considering within this structured decision-making process? And so that's what's within the boundaries, but also what is outside the boundaries. So as we all know that reefs is complex socio-ecological systems. There's often quite a few programs, stakeholders, but also context and dimensions to consider. So this was, as you can see from the diagram underneath there, was quite a detailed and interesting discussion, but we got there in terms of the boundaries. As with case study 1, developing assessment criteria is key to this. You can see some overlaps with that other piece of work, all the way through from ones about certainty down the bottom right, which is about how certain were we that the projects themselves would successfully resolve the gap within the funding cycle, all the way through to higher level objectives such as, does it fill a critical knowledge gap for assessing the performance of management against the Reef 2050 objectives. On the left, we can see, similar to case study 1, relative weightings were established through expert elicitation. So this was a slightly more complex discussion here, where we had concepts of what was the maximum score for each of these work packages amongst the experts that assessed it. What was the minimum score? What was the average? And some other more detailed statistics in between. With this one, there was over 40 different projects under consideration, and the budget was quite limited. So by looking at various different variables about weightings of the criteria and which organisations were involved, we were able to identify which projects ranked at the top, which were below the budget cutoff, which ones were a bit lower ranked, and which ones consistently floated to the top. By the end of the project, we managed to get alignment amongst the scientific management and policy stakeholders on what the top 12 projects were for investment. So you can see on the right here, for example, that there's various projects and they're ranked according to 6 different perspectives. You can see the ones that are a little bit more green across the board were the ones that floated more to the top, and the ones a little bit more red floated more to the bottom. So there was good alignment in the end about what the 12 projects were that were to be forwarded through to the funding partner for investment. This was then presented to the funder by the group that brought together, and along with the rationale for prioritisation. This allowed the funders and the various project proponents to then commence their more detailed funding processes. So that comes to the end of our formal presentation. So today we went through some of the theory about structured decision making. So hopefully that's been useful to you in terms of understanding a little bit more about what that process and framework is all about. A little bit of a brief on the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program and where structured decision making has fit into that, including guiding the research and development and deployment decisions, and a couple of case studies in reef management executed over the last 4 years. And we hope that that's given some good examples of how to use structured decision making, and hopefully tease some thoughts about how you might be able to use these sorts of processes in your work and your context. And that's the end of our formal presentation.
Thank you both so much for that. It was really interesting. If we have any questions, as I said earlier, you can type them into the question box, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you to speak. No questions. It was so clear that nobody has any questions. Oh, we have a question. B. Bacon, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
You mentioned this much in 4 years. I was wondering, is that the entire process? Some of this that are not been earlier than 4 years.
I'm sorry, your audio is really difficult to hear. Would you maybe be able to type your question in? We have another question that says, how long have your processes taken?
I'll take that. So anywhere from 4 weeks to 6 months, depending on the complexity of the challenge. So that the 2 examples we showed here, the first one was about sort of 2.5 months, and I think the second one was probably around the same mark. Most of the time, 4. Sorry, thanks, Jerome. Most of the time with the process is in the knowledge generation phase. So characterizing the options you're comparing is where the time with these processes can take time. But where we do it in sort of shorter time periods is either where that information exists already, so it's a matter of synthesis and engagement, or where we're using the process to get an early view in terms of how things might be sort of comparing, to guide further effort and activity on getting more clarity before we get to a decision point.
Right, and we got that one typed. It said, you mentioned 4 years. Were some action steps taken during that time? Or basically, was it 4 years worth of planning before work could be started?
Yeah, I can take this one. Yeah, so I think, is that Mr. Bacon? Is that question? Yeah, I think he's referring to the slide with the range of decisions over 4 years. So I think there was quite a few different contexts in there. So I think there was maybe 5 different, maybe even 6 different decision contexts there. So quite a few of the earlier ones have been implemented already. While some of the later ones, I think they've all been implemented actually, except for a couple of the ones on the Reef Restoration Adaptation project. A lot of them were around, as Myron spoke to, getting an early view. So what that did is allow decision makers to look much further into the future and say, if we were to implement something in, say, 5 years' time, how do our various options perform? But by looking at those options themselves, you can actually make a decision about a very early investment to say, do we even go down the path of getting towards that point where we can implement those ones? So there was a range of different contexts there, and I would say most of them have been actioned, except for the ones that were looking at that very long-term view. And in those cases, they are examples where that longer-term view has allowed the investment to be made in the first step to move towards those actions.
Okay, another person asked, what do you sense are the biggest hurdles for coral reef or marine managers to incorporate structured decision-making while planning research projects?
Yeah, probably a few challenges. I think there's well, uncertainty is hard to grapple with. The level of the Great Barrier Reef is, I think, talked about as being the most studied ecosystem on Earth. And there's a lot we know, and there's a lot more we don't know. And that's in spite of the fantastic research and modeling and characterization work that goes on. So I think people are uncomfortable making decisions in uncertainty, and so the idea that you're making a decision regardless of the approach can make people feel uncomfortable and sends people down a bias towards holding off on making the decision in search of more information. And I think that's where sort of helping people overcome some of those priors around needing more information, I think is something that we've seen work quite well, and getting people comfortable with being able to make decisions under uncertainty, and sort of switching thinking from this is going to guarantee us the best outcome to this is the best choice of those we have available to us with the information we have at the time in which we need to make the decision. And I think some of that sort of conceptual training is one. I think the other challenge is around the sheer number of stakeholders and interested parties that are often involved or useful to be involved in these processes. So most of our sort of applications within the Great Barrier Reef have had 30 plus people. So getting that level of input and alignment and even just the time to get all those people together, people look at that and go, oh, it's going to take me too long. And that seems very complicated and complex. So that's another sort of sometimes a barrier to seeing people adopt structured decision making. And then probably the third piece that we see here locally is sort of the political context. So we've got a lot of a lot of big investment in the reef. It's it's a World Heritage listed area. It's it's an icon in Australia, and very, very, very senior decision makers can be uncomfortable with objective decision processes because in highly politicized and highly political environments, very, very senior decision makers like to retain I guess some degree of subjectivity in how they might justify a decision. So that's probably they're probably the three sort of observations that we've had with respect to corals. Jerome, I'll invite you to comment as well.
Yeah, and I think that those are three good ones. Probably two others I'd add is there's a high degree for reef managers. There's a high degree of complexity. So it's a very complex socio-ecological and technical sort of ecosystem. Being led into reef managers' worlds has been quite eye-opening about the sort of challenges and complexities they have to sort of juggle on a day-to-day basis. And so that in terms of decision making, that brings in quite complex ideas of trade-offs Are there winners? Are there losers? Can there be both at the same time in acceptable amounts? And I think that's where, to Myron's point about lots of folks involved in the decision processes, we've found that decision making in reef managers context are very consensus based, and so requires time, it requires discussion, it requires inquiry, and that sort of speaks back to Myron's point about how comfortable folks are with sort of the information and a little bit of that sort of skilling up, I guess, in sort of looking at things across uncertainties for the best performer as opposed to sort of waiting for perfect information. Yeah, a very juicy challenge for reef managers, that's for sure.
Okay, regarding your surveys of objective salience, how much context did you supply versus just asking the questions, or did all of your stakeholders already understand the process?
I can take that one. I think the with structured decision making, you probably saw from our presentation that we focus quite heavily on the process, and I think it's absolutely it's important for them to be aligned with the process. In fact, that's for us as decision practitioners, that's our number one concern, is that all the stakeholders involved are comfortable with the process. So part of that in the early parts of an engagement is to speak with many of those who are involved about how they see the objectives and how they see the potential criteria. And then there's some alignment sessions around sort of co-developing what those criteria might be. So what we tend to find is by the time you actually get to the survey process, there's quite a lot of shared understanding amongst the stakeholders about what those criteria are and what they in fact mean. It's always quite interesting as well, because when we propose something that's composed of such few words, often that can be interpreted in multiple different ways, and it's important to bring that out to make sure that there's sort of a common alignment in a discursive way prior to sort of going into anything that's semi-quantitative.
Okay, thanks. What feedback have you gotten from managers? Did they find the process useful? And what advice do you have to recruit managers to do structured decision making?
It's a really good question. I think the feedback we've had is overwhelmingly positive. Through each of the contexts we've applied it, and for the most part because we've helped them arrive at a decision point that people have aligned to. I think sometimes, actually probably commonly, people find it can be quite an exhaustive process. There's a lot of engagement involved. And so people are fielding questions from people during the process about, whether it's lack of understanding or level of comfort or not, those sort of queries. And so that sort of, to Jerome's point, keeping people sort of, across the process and understanding the process throughout takes a lot of effort, not just from us, but from the manager themselves. I think probably one thing we've observed in our work in the Grappa Reef is that there's not that many people who are, I guess, who've got the bandwidth to apply the level of intellectual thought and into these sort of decisions. So a lot of people are focused on very tactical or disproportionately on the tactical things they have to be responsible for. And then what happens is that there's sort of, these sort of more strategic questions are left to them to sort of figure out and solve, but they don't get enough time to dedicate it to it. And I think that's been one of the challenges, in getting people to adopt this more broadly, is that they look at it and they go, there's a fair bit of effort involved, but I've got 1,000 other things to do. And so I'll just keep deferring this, and I know I need to do it, but and then by the time you get to the point where you have to make the decision, it can be sometimes a little bit too difficult to get the time to apply the approach. So they're probably the sort of two observations we've had.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think it's the core of that issue for reef managers is that the decision, they're often given custodianship of a decision process, which is not necessarily under their delegation of authority. So, for example, a reef manager is asked to say, hey, can you help prioritize this set of projects for the next 12 months in terms of the action plan? But actually the context under which that those projects sit is much broader than their portfolio, and so that's quite a challenging concept for anybody. If you suddenly you need to gather a bunch of your colleagues at the same level, sometimes in a different organization, often in reef context in other organizations. You need to bring them all together and sort of guide through a process that prioritizes across everybody's contexts. You know, there's a lot of complexity there in terms of whose projects, how long, how much, those sorts of things. And so to Myron's point, that can be quite an overwhelming challenge when put in the context of sort of the busyness of the everyday. Which in reef context, tactically, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of competing priorities.
So this question is somewhat related. If you don't have time to implement a full lengthy process, and I would add to that also, like you don't have people like yourselves to lead somebody through a structured decision making, are there some key takeaways that you could suggest for a small team that needs to make a decision quickly and without, I guess, sort of a knowledgeable team to lead them through the decision-making process?
My advice is always, and it's been the same for 15 years, it's do the framing well, because that's a relatively low investment of time compared to the whole process, but it probably has the most value of any aspects of the process. Is actually get really clear alignment on what the group is trying to achieve, what outcomes are trying to be delivered, what are the choices that enable you to do that, and how might you go about comparing those? Because I think if you can get alignment on that, that sets the framework for how you then go through the rest. And then it's about, beyond that, it's typically time limited and resource limited in terms of what you can do, in terms of getting information, in terms of how rigorous you can be with the analysis, etc. But if you frame it well, you've at least then got the building blocks for being able to invest in further analysis or further engagement, etc. Or less. Sometimes just framing it well enables clarity on a subset of choices which are really strong versus a whole bunch which are not. So that would be my advice. Just as a minimum, do the framing.
And probably my one piece of advice would be to talk regularly to all the stakeholders who need to be involved in that decision, and I think that includes not just those given custodianship of the process, but also who might you need to present the results to, who might need to be made decisions at sort of the edges of that. Make sure that they're sort of involved, and often with particularly speaking to stakeholders to which the results of these sorts of things are, I guess, shown or aligned with, often their perspective on it is much simpler than we suspect. We often find that they're very sort of action oriented, and it can actually, once you present them with your frame, they can often say, give you quite a lot of comfort that you're able to get through the process even with limited time and resources.
I was just going to add one more comment as well, just to what Jerome said. So, and the other dimension as well is with what Jerome's describing with those stakeholders is with respect to the decision makers themselves. Ask what needs to be true for the decision to be made right up front. So I think oftentimes people, especially people who are engineers and scientists like Jerome and I, we love going into problem solving mode, and which is important and great. But if you actually just as part of that framing or even advance of that framing, just ask, well, what needs to be true for the decision maker to make a decision, not for an outcome, but for a decision. That also, and then if that provides the sort of the guideposts for the work that you then undertake, and regardless of how rigorous it is.
Great, thanks. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I don't see any more. Would you guys be interested in just showing your sort of appendix slides of the what I would call one-pagers? I think you had like 3 at the end that were. You can see if there's anything about that.
Would you like us to chat through them, Caitlin?
Sure, yeah.
This one looks like, do you want to do this one, MS?
Sure, yeah, so this is just a simplified summary of the RRAP context that Jerome presented at the outset. I'll focus your attention on the bottom right corner. Ultimately, the types of decisions that we're helping RRAP or helping guide in RRAP are things like, where should we undertake field trials? Where on a reef should we be thinking about deploying a particular intervention? Which interventions are we going to continue to invest in R&D budget in? What's the scale over which we can be deploying a particular intervention? These are sort of decision questions that we're being asked to support. And so there's a knowledge chain that we're working on. So there's obviously the impact of climate change on the reef. That's both in terms of the ecological impact, but the broader social and economic impact of those changes due to climate change. There's then the interventions that the groups are all, the scientists and engineers are coming up with, and those interventions applied at different locations and different scales deliver different outcomes and represent different costs, and have different levels of efficacy. So understanding and modeling and characterizing those. And then and the bottom sort of row there talks to, once we understand that the impact of those interventions, what does that then mean in terms of ecological benefit across different metrics? So different metrics of reef condition, and now looking more broadly at other elements of the ecosystem like fisheries, impacts, etc. What's the broader social and economic benefit? So what value are we gaining in a climate change or climate change disrupted future of these investments? There's obviously a risk lens to this. There's the risk of unintended consequences from these interventions. There's also the uncertainty in outcome from these interventions. And that whole knowledge change of information, which is being generated by the entire program, we're sort of responsible for consolidating, synthesizing, and then communicating what that then means in terms of the selection and deployment of those interventions. So that's sort of just a bit of a different lens on what Jerome showed earlier. Next slide, Jerome. And I won't talk to this one again. This is the example I spoke to before, the case study one.
I can chat to this one. And I guess the last slide is a little bit more of the theory that Mayuran and I have based this work on over the course of the last 4 years. We were lucky enough to be able to publish that, so you can have a look at that if you like. It's really a bit of a summary of that first chart that you saw, or at least a subset of it. But I guess really sort of speaks to the concept of quality decisions being what I guess the structured decision making wheelhouse is all about, which leads to a commitment to action. And I think that the important message that we try to bring through with quality decision making in any context. We sort of came from the asset intensive industries, so infrastructure, water utilities, power, mining, and other sort of energy companies. That's a space that we've spent a lot of our career working in this sort of stuff. When we actually apply this to natural resources management, and the context here being the Great Barrier Reef, we found it very applicable. And the key message we sort of we always give is that this is the primacy of people first. This is about people making decisions. Then it's about the process that you take those people through to be comfortable with those decisions and thus commit to action. And then after that, it's about the knowledge that we generate to the level that we're able to in the time and resources we have. And then it's about the tools that we might use. So yeah, I guess that's a bit of a summary of more of the theory behind how we do these things. That's the end of our slides, Caitlin.
Great, thanks. Can you now, I guess, hop back to our kind of
Sure.
finishing up slides here?
Is that the one?
All right. So, yep, this is good. So thanks again to both of you for the presentations and to everyone for being here. The webinar, a recording of the webinar will be sent out to the Reef Resilience Network email list tomorrow. It can also be found at the reefresilience.org website, along with all our other webinars. And you can also connect with us through email or any of our social media handles. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to put a plug in for a Reef Resilience Network mentored course called Coral Reef Restoration that's going to be starting next week. And you can sign up through, or sorry, it's starting May 4th. You can sign up through April 29th, which is the end of this week. So it's not too late. Go ahead and sign up for that course. It runs through June. And with that, we'll close everything out. Thank you guys again for your time. And have a great night, day, whatever people's time zones are. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.